For 15 years, Frank Morrison walked the halls of the Pentagon as a ghost. To the powerful generals planning wars in the E-ring, he was just an old man pushing a squeaky coffee cart, dismissed by arrogant officers who didn't even know his name. But the atmosphere in the room shattered the moment General Marcus Hale, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, spotted a faded silver star hidden beneath Frank's work vest. The room fell silent as the four-star general realized the man pouring his coffee was the Iron Lion, the fearless hero who had saved his life on Hamburger Hill 54 years ago. This is the story of a legend who served in silence. Where are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments. If this journey of valor touched you, consider subscribing to Silent Veterans and help us give a voice to more incredible stories of our silent veterans. The conference room was on the 3rd floor, E-ring, the outer corridor where the most senior officers worked. Frank Morrison moved through the hallway with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd spent 15 years as civilian support staff, his cartwheels squeaking softly against the polished floor. He wore the standard uniform of Pentagon service workers, dark slacks, a gray work vest over a faded olive drab shirt that had once been his army uniform, worn so many times the fabric had thinned to softness. On the left breast of that shirt, barely visible beneath the vest, was a small silver star, its once bright finish dulled by decades and countless washings, the ribbon faded from deep blue to pale gray. He'd been called in on short notice. Emergency briefing. 4 generals. Coffee and water service required. The usual staff person had called in sick, and Frank had volunteered to cover the shift. He didn't mind. At 77, sleep came hard anyway, and the early morning walk through the empty Pentagon corridors gave him time to think, to remember, to carry the weight of memory in a place that had mostly forgotten. He knocked twice on the conference room door, a courtesy more than a requirement, then pushed the cart inside. The room was designed to intimidate, to remind everyone who entered that decisions made here shape the world. A long, mahogany table dominated the space, its surface polished to a mirror shine, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than Frank's monthly pension. One wall was entirely glass, offering a view of the flight line where F-35 Lightning IIs sat gleaming in the morning sun, their swept wings and angular surfaces representing the cutting edge of American military power. The other walls held framed maps, Afghanistan with its mountain ranges traced in red, Iraq with its sectarian divisions marked in different colors, the Korean Peninsula with the DMZ highlighted, the South China Sea with its disputed islands circled, reminders of conflicts past, present, and potentially future. 4 men sat at the table, their uniforms heavy with ribbons and stars that caught the fluorescent light. General Marcus Hale, 4 stars on his collar, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, his face lined with the weight of command. General Thompson, Army, 3 stars, his expression stern and calculating. General Johnson, Air Force, 3 stars, younger than the others, his eyes sharp with intelligence. General Rodriguez, Marine Corps, 3 stars, his posture parade ground perfect even seated. And standing near the head of the table, a colonel named Derek Foster, his uniform so crisp it looked like it had been pressed moments ago, his expression impatient and irritated at the interruption. Frank moved quietly around the table, setting down cups with practiced precision, pouring coffee from the insulated carafe. Black for General Thompson, who waved away the offer of cream and sugar for Rodriguez, who nodded his thanks without looking up. Johnson took his coffee with just cream, and General Hale drank his black and scalding hot. Frank had learned these preferences over the years, had memorized the habits of dozens of senior officers, another small way of serving that went unnoticed and unappreciated. The situation in the strait is deteriorating faster than our models predicted, General Johnson was saying, his finger tracing a line on a satellite image spread across the table. We have 72 hours, maybe less, before this becomes a shooting war. Their naval forces are mobilizing, and our carriers are still 3 days out. If they move before we're in position, we're looking at a potential catastrophe. Frank poured General Hale's coffee, his movements economical and practiced, the result of 15 years of invisible service. The general's eyes were fixed on the maps, his jaw tight, his hands clasped so hard the knuckles were white. Frank had seen that expression before, a lifetime ago, on the faces of officers making decisions that would send men to die, that would change lives and end them, that carried weight no amount of training could fully prepare you for. The diplomatic channels are exhausted, General Thompson added, his voice grim. State Department says we're out of options except military response. The President wants a plan on his desk by 1800 hours today. Full spectrum options. From show of force to direct engagement. Sir, your coffee. Colonel Foster's voice was sharp, annoyed, cutting through the tension like a knife. He gestured impatiently at Frank, not quite looking at him. You're blocking the display. Move along. We don't have time for interruptions. Frank nodded. No offense taken. He'd been dismissed by better men and worse. Had learned decades ago that taking offense at small slights was a waste of energy better spent elsewhere. He finished pouring and started to push his cart toward the door, the wheels squeaking slightly, a sound that had become so familiar he barely heard it anymore. Wait. General Hale's voice was quiet, but carried the weight of command that came from 4 decades of service and the authority of the nation's highest military position. The room fell silent instantly, every officer's attention snapping to the general. Hold on a moment. Frank stopped, his hand on the cart handle, his posture neutral and patient. Sir? General Hale stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor, the sound loud in the sudden silence. He walked around the table with deliberate steps, his eyes never leaving Frank's chest, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition to something that looked like disbelief and awe mixed together. Specifically, the general's gaze was locked on the small silver star visible where Frank's vest had shifted slightly as he reached to pour the last cup of coffee. That medal, General Hale said, his voice strange, tight, the words coming out carefully as if he was afraid of what the answer might be. Where did you get that? Frank glanced down at the star, then back at the general, his expression calm and neutral. I earned it, sir. Vietnam. Long time ago. May of 1969. Vietnam. General Hale's face had gone pale, the color draining from his cheeks as if he'd been physically struck. His hand came up slowly, not quite touching the metal, hovering inches away as if it might burn him or disappear if he made contact. When? What unit? What battle? Frank kept his voice neutral, professional, the way he'd learned to speak to officers who outranked him by galaxies of authority and power. 5th Battalion, 7th Cavalry, 1st Brigade, 101st Airborne Division, Hamburger Hill, Sir Hill, 937, in the A Shaw Valley. The assault lasted 10 days. I was there for all of them. The conference room had gone completely silent. The satellite images on the table, the crisis in the strait, the urgent timeline, all of it forgotten. The other generals were watching now, confused, sensing something significant happening but not understanding what idai, their briefing materials forgotten in their hands. General Hale took a step back, his hand coming up to cover his mouth, his eyes searching Frank's face with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. The general's breath was coming faster now, his military composure cracking like ice under pressure. What's your name? Your full name and rank. Frank Morrison, sir. Sergeant Major, United States Army, retired. I served 30 years, mustered out in 1996 as an E9. Been working here at the Pentagon as civilian support staff for the last 15 years. The general took another step back, and now his hand was trembling, actually trembling, something Frank had never seen in a 4-star officer. Oh my God. Oh my God. You're Frank Morrison. You're the Iron Lion. You're the man who held the line. You're the reason I'm alive. Colonel Foster stepped forward, his confusion evident, his irritation at the interruption warring with concern for his superior officer. Sir, what's going on? Who is this man? General Hale held up a hand, cutting him off, never taking his eyes from Frank's face. His voice, when he spoke, was shaking, decades of military bearing and control giving way to raw emotion. Gentlemen, do you know who's been serving our coffee? Do you have any idea who this man is? This is Sergeant Major Frank Morrison, the Iron Lion of Hamburger Hill. In May of 1969, during the Battle for Hill 937, he saved 23 lives under fire. He held a position that every tactical manual said was indefensible. He was wounded 3 times and refused medical evacuation until every single man under his command was safe, including me. The moment General Hale said those words, spoke that date and that place and that battle, the conference room began to dissolve in Frank's mind like smoke and wind. The polished mahogany table became red mud churned by artillery and monsoon rain. The air conditioning became the suffocating heat and humidity of the jungle in May, the kind of wet heat that soaked through your uniform and never let go, that made every breath feel like drowning. The smell of coffee gave way to gunpowder and blood, and the acrid stench of napalm that clung to everything, that got into your pores and your lungs and never quite left. Frank was no longer 77. He was 25, his uniform soaked with sweat and other men's blood, his M16 rifle hot enough to burn his hands, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over the thunder of artillery and small arms fire that never seemed to stop, that went on for days, until the sound became a physical thing you carried inside your skull. The hill had no official name except the number on the military maps, Hill 937. But the soldiers who fought there, who bled and died on its slopes, called it Hamburger Hill because it ground men up like meat in a grinder, because it consumed whole companies and spat out survivors who would never be whole again. The North Vietnamese army had fortified the summit with bunkers and tunnels and machine gun nests, had turned it into a fortress that commanded the entire valley. American command had decided it needed to be taken, that the strategic value justified the cost. It was the 10th day of the assault when Frank's platoon was sent up. The 10th day of hell that would stretch into 11. Frank's platoon, what was left of it after 9 days of brutal fighting, was pinned down 50 meters from the summit, caught in a kill zone that the NVA had prepared with deadly precision. They'd lost their platoon leader, First Lieutenant Richards, in the first 10 minutes of the assault, stepped on a bouncing Betty mine that had torn him apart so completely there wasn't enough left to send home. The radio man, Specialist Torres, was dead with a bullet through his throat, the handset still clutched in his hand. Half the platoon was wounded, bleeding into the mud, their cries for medics mixing with the crack of AK-47 fire and the deeper boom of RPG launches, and the NVA was pouring fire down on them from reinforced positions that American artillery couldn't touch without risking friendly fire casualties that would have been catastrophic. Frank lay behind a fallen teak tree, its trunk torn and splintered by bullets. His M16 aimed uphill at an enemy he could barely see through the rain and smoke, his mind racing through tactical options that all seemed to end in death. Beside him, a young second lieutenant named Marcus Hale was bleeding from a shrapnel wound in his left leg. The fabric of his uniform soaked dark red, his face pale with shock and pain, and the kind of fear that came from knowing you were about to die, and there was nothing you could do about it. "We have to fall back," Hale gasped, his voice high and tight with panic, his hands shaking as he tried to wrap a bandage around his own leg. "We have to retreat. We can't take that position. It's suicide. We'll all die if we stay here." Frank didn't look at him. His eyes were scanning the terrain with the intensity born of 20 months in country, calculating angles and distances and fields of fire, looking for any advantage, any weakness in the enemy position that could be exploited. "We don't retreat, sir. We hold this position until reinforcements arrive. If we fall back now, the NVA will roll down this hill and overrun the battalion aid station. Hundreds of wounded men with no protection. We're all that's standing between them and a massacre. There are no reinforcements." Hale's voice was breaking, tears mixing with rain and mud on his face. "Look around. Everyone's pinned down. Every unit in the brigade is engaged. Command isn't sending help because there is no help to send. We're going to die here for nothing." "Then we die holding this ground," Frank said, his voice calm, matter of fact, as if they were discussing the weather instead of their own mortality. "But we're not dying today, Lieutenant. I didn't survive Tet and Khe Sanh to get killed on some nameless hill because we gave up. I'm not letting that happen. Not to you, not to these men, not to anyone." He keyed the radio. The handset splattered with blood from the dead radio man, his thumb slippery on the transmit button. "Any call sign? Any call sign? This is Viper 3. Platoon leader down. Acting platoon sergeant assuming command. We are pinned down at grid coordinates 479er 321. Multiple casualties. Request immediate fire support and medevac. How copy? Static crackled for long seconds. Then a voice, distant and distorted by interference, barely audible over the sound of fighting. Viper 3. This is Thunder 6. Fire support unavailable. All batteries engaged supporting other units. Medevac unavailable due to weather and enemy fire. You are on your own. Hold your position if possible. Good luck. Out. Frank looked at the radio for a moment, then set it down carefully. He looked around at the men, his men now, whether he wanted the responsibility or not. 23 faces, most of them barely old enough to vote. All of them looking at him with the desperate hope that he had an answer, a plan, some way out of this nightmare that was going to get them all killed. He did have a plan. It just wasn't a good one. Listen up, Frank called out, his voice cutting through the chaos and fear like a command from God himself. We're going to take that hill, not because some general 100 miles away ordered it, not because it's in the tactical plan, because if we don't, if we fall back, the NVA is going to use this high ground to slaughter every wounded American down in that valley. Our brothers, our friends, men who are depending on us to hold the line. So we're going to hold, and then we're going to advance, and we're going to win. That's not optional. That's an order. That's suicide. Someone shouted from behind a boulder, his voice raw with terror. We can't take that position. They'll kill us all. Maybe, Frank said calmly. But they're going to have to work for it. And I'll tell you what I know. I know that the NVA up there are just as tired as we are, just as scared, just as wet and miserable. The difference is, we're Americans. We don't quit. We don't break. And we sure as hell don't leave our brothers to die because we were too scared to do our jobs. Now check your ammo, redistribute from the casualties, and get ready to move on my command. He didn't wait for argument or discussion. He simply rose to one knee, aimed his M16 at the nearest enemy position, fired a controlled burst that made the NVA soldiers duck for cover, and started moving forward, not retreating, not holding, advancing, into the fire, into almost certain death, because someone had to win, and he was the ranking NCO, and that meant the responsibility was his. The next 8 hours became the stuff of legend, the kind of story that gets told in army schools and written about in history books, though never quite capturing the reality of mud and blood and terror. Frank led from the front, his rifle barking in short controlled bursts, his voice never stopping, directing fire, calling out targets, identifying weak points in the enemy defense, dragging wounded men to cover with strength that shouldn't have existed in a body pushed beyond its limits. When his M16 jammed from the mud and rain, he picked up an AK-47 from a fallen NVA soldier and kept fighting, the enemy weapon feeling strange in his hands but functional. When a machine gun nest threatened to overrun their position from the flank, he crawled within grenade range through 20 meters of open ground, bullets kicking up mud around him, and silenced it with 2 fragmentation grenades thrown with the precision of a man who'd done this before and knew exactly how much time he had before the enemy adjusted their aim. Lieutenant Hale, despite his wound and his terror, stayed with Frank through all of it. The young officer was shaking, tears streaming down his face, but he didn't break or run. He loaded magazines with trembling hands, called out enemy positions when Frank's attention was focused elsewhere, helped coordinate their dwindling forces with the kind of desperate courage that comes from watching someone else refuse to give up, even when all hope is gone. And slowly, impossibly, against every tactical principle and probability, they held their ground. Frank took his first wound at hour 3, shrapnel from an RPG that detonated against a tree 10 meters away, a piece of hot metal the size of a quarter burying itself in his left side, just above his hip. It felt like being punched by a heavyweight boxer, a deep burning pain that made his vision gray at the edges. He pressed his hand against it, felt hot blood soaking through his uniform, and kept moving because stopping meant dying. The second wound came at hour 5, a bullet graze across his ribs on the right side, a through and through that tore muscle and burned like fire but missed anything vital. He packed it with part of a field dressing, wrapped it tight enough to slow the bleeding, and kept fighting because the men around him were still fighting and someone had to lead them. The third wound came at hour 7 turn, when an NVA soldier got close enough for hand-to-hand combat. Close enough that Frank could see the man's face, young and terrified just like the Americans. The soldier had a bayonet, and he was fast, and the blade opened up Frank's left forearm in a long slash that cut to the bone. Frank killed him with the butt of his rifle, a brutal strike to the temple, and wrapped his arm with strips torn from his uniform shirt, tying the improvised bandage with his teeth while his right hand still held his weapon ready. Air support finally arrived at dusk. Cobra gunships and F-4 Phantoms that tore the summit apart with rockets and napalm and 20mm cannon fire. The explosion so close Frank could feel the heat wash over his position, could smell his own hair singeing. Under that covering fire, with the NVA position suppressed and burning, Frank led his men forward in a final assault. They took the hill. All 23 survivors made it to the top, not one man left behind. Frank collapsed against a shattered NVA bunker, his back against the sandbags, his body finally acknowledging the wounds he'd ignored for 8 hours of sustained combat. Blood soaked his uniform from 3 different wounds. His hands were burned from handling a rifle barrel that had gotten so hot it had melted part of the handguard, and his vision was starting to tunnel from blood loss and exhaustion. A medic appeared through the smoke, a young specialist whose hands were already red with other men's blood, and he tried to put Frank on a stretcher for immediate evacuation. "No," Frank said, his voice a rasp, his throat raw from shouting orders and breathing smoke. "Not until every one of my men is evacuated first. Wounded get priority. I can wait. Sir, you're losing blood. You need a surgeon. If you don't get evacuated now, you might not make it." I said no. Frank's eyes, despite the pain and exhaustion, were hard as iron. His hand reached out and grabbed the medic's wrist with surprising strength. "Those men fought for 8 hours because I told them to. Because I promised them we'd win. I'm not getting on a helicopter until every single one of them is on one first. That's final. Now go help someone who needs it more than I do." The medic hesitated, clearly wanting to argue, but something in Frank's eyes made him nod and move on to the next casualty. Frank's eyes found Lieutenant Hale, who was being bandaged by another medic 30 feet away, his leg properly splinted now, his face still pale but no longer the deathly white of shock. The young officer was staring at Frank with an expression somewhere between awe and disbelief, and something that might have been worship. "You saved my life," Hale said, his voice shaking, the words coming out like a confession. "You saved all of us. You should be dead. We all should be dead. Every tactical manual says we should have retreated. That holding that position was impossible. But you did it anyway." Frank managed a tired smile through the pain and exhaustion. "Dying's easy, Lieutenant. Any coward can die. Living takes work. Leading takes more. Remember that when you get your command. The men come first, always, before the mission, before the orders, before your own life. You take care of them. They'll take care of you." 3 months later, after the field hospital and the surgery and the long recovery in a hospital in Japan, where Frank had time to think about what he'd done and what it had cost, they held a ceremony. Frank barely remembered it because of the morphine for the pain of healing wounds that had gotten infected despite the antibiotics. But they pinned the silver star on his chest while cameras flashed and officers made speeches about valor and sacrifice. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an enemy of the United States while serving as acting platoon leader with the 5th Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment." The citation didn't mention that he'd disobeyed a direct order to retreat, that he'd kept fighting with 3 separate wounds that should have incapacitated him, that he'd held an impossible position through sheer refusal to accept defeat. The official version was always cleaner than the truth. The medal was nice, a piece of metal and ribbon that weighed almost nothing but somehow felt heavy every time Frank looked at it. But what mattered to him wasn't the medal. It was the letter he received 6 months later, forwarded through military postal services, from Lieutenant Marcus Hale, now Captain Hale, recovered from his wounds and back in command of a company. The letter was handwritten on lined paper, the ink smudged in places. Sergeant Major Morrison, it read, "Thank you for teaching me what leadership means. Thank you for showing me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Thank you for my life." I'm getting married next month to my high school sweetheart. We're going to have children, build a life, grow old together. All of that exists because you decided that a terrified second lieutenant was worth saving. I'm naming my first son after you, Frank Morrison Hale, so he grows up knowing the name of the man who gave him a father. I hope someday I can repay the debt I owe you, though I know that's impossible. With deepest respect and gratitude, Marcus Hale, CPT, USA. Frank had kept that letter for 54 years. It was in his wallet right now, folded and refolded so many times the creases were starting to tear. The ink faded, but still readable. He blinked, and 54 years collapsed like a house of cards. The mud and blood and terror dissolved into polished floors and air conditioning and the antiseptic smell of a modern office building. The screams of wounded men became the quiet hum of Pentagon ventilation systems. Frank was back in the conference room, his hand still on the coffee cart handle, and General Marcus Hale, that terrified lieutenant grown old and powerful, wearing 4 stars that represented the pinnacle of military achievement, was staring at him with tears running unashamedly down his face. "I've been looking for you for 30 years, General Hale said, his voice breaking, his military composure completely shattered by the weight of emotion and memory. After I made general, after I had the resources and authority, I tried to find you. Put out inquiries through Army personnel systems, checked veteran databases, hired private investigators. They said you'd retired, moved away, left no forwarding address, no contact information. I thought maybe you'd passed away, that I'd lost the chance to say thank you one more time. And here you've been the whole time, right here in this building, serving coffee, walking these halls invisible while the rest of us pretend we're important. Just doing my job, sir," Frank said quietly, his voice steady and calm despite the emotion in the room. "Same job I've always done. Taking care of people. Serving. It's what I know. Your job." General Hale laughed, a sound somewhere between joy and pain and something that might have been anger at the injustice of it all. "Your job." He turned to face the other generals, his voice rising. "Gentlemen, let me tell you about this man's job. On May 20th, 1969, Sergeant Morrison held an indefensible position against overwhelming enemy forces for 8 hours. He was wounded 3 separate times: shrapnel, gunshot, blade, and refused medical evacuation until every single man under his command was safe. He saved 23 lives that day, including mine. He kept us alive through tactical brilliance and sheer refusal to give up when any sane person would have retreated. He stepped closer to Frank, his hand reaching out to grip the old sergeant's shoulder. "I have a son because of you. Frank Morrison Hale, captain currently deployed in Syria. I have grandchildren, a career spanning 40 years. Everything I am, everything I've accomplished, every decision I've made in this uniform exists because you decided that a terrified second lieutenant was worth saving, and you asked for nothing in return. Not recognition, not advancement, not even a simple thank you. You just went back to work, kept serving, kept leading, kept taking care of soldiers for another 27 years after Vietnam. Then you retired and came here, to this building, and kept serving in a different way. I did what any NCO would do," Frank said simply. "Took care of my men, that's the job. That's always been the job." "No." General Hale's voice was firm now, the commanding officer reasserting itself over the emotional man, though his eyes were still bright with unshed tears. "No, what you did was extraordinary, and the fact that you've spent 15 years pushing a coffee cart through these halls, being invisible, while officers who never heard a shot fired in anger sit in corner offices making 6-figure salaries, is a disgrace. A disgrace to this institution and everything it claims to represent." He turned to address Colonel Foster, whose face had gone pale, who was beginning to understand the magnitude of his earlier dismissiveness. "Colonel N, did you know who this man was when you told him to move along earlier? When you dismissed him like he was an inconvenience?" "No, sir," Foster managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I had no idea. I thought he was just what? Just a service worker. Just another face you don't need to acknowledge." General Hale's voice was cold now, the warmth replaced by command authority and barely controlled anger. "That's the problem, Colonel. That's exactly the problem. You see a person in civilian clothes serving coffee and you assume they're nobody. You never ask, never look beyond the surface. Never consider that the man pouring your coffee might have more combat experience, more leadership experience, more wisdom than everyone in this room combined. He turned back to address all the officers present. From this day forward, I want it known throughout this building and every command I have authority over that Sergeant Major Frank Morrison is to be treated with the respect his service demands. He is not just a civilian worker. He is a decorated combat veteran, a Silver Star recipient, a man who exemplifies everything we claim to value in this profession. And every officer in this building should take time to learn his story, because it has more to teach about leadership and courage than any textbook or academy course ever will. Sir, Frank said quietly, that's not necessary. I don't need special treatment. I never asked for recognition. I just wanted to keep serving in whatever way I could. You're not getting special treatment, General Hale said, his voice softening. You're getting the treatment you should have been receiving all along. Frank, why? Why take a service position here after you retired? You had 30 years in full pension. You could have done anything, gone anywhere. Why come here and push a coffee cart? Frank was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts, choosing his words carefully. Because I'm still serving, sir. Just in a different way. These halls, these offices, they're filled with young officers making decisions about war, sending men and women into combat, authorizing operations that will change lives and end them. I figured if I was here, even just serving coffee and cleaning conference rooms, maybe I could remind them that those decisions have faces, have consequences. That the people they're sending into harm's way aren't just numbers on a briefing slide or pins on a map. They're real people with families and dreams and futures that might get cut short because of what gets decided in rooms like this. The room was completely silent. Even the hum of the ventilation system seemed to fade away. General Johnson, who'd been quiet throughout the entire exchange, spoke up, his voice thoughtful. How long have you been working here, Sergeant Major? 15 years, Frank said. Started when I was 62. Needed something to do after full retirement. Couldn't just sit at home. Tried it for 6 months and nearly went crazy. My wife passed away 10 years ago. No children of my own. This job gave me purpose, gave me a way to still be part of something larger than myself. And in those 15 years, General Rodriguez asked, his expression troubled, have any officers asked about your service? About that medal you wear? Frank shook his head slowly. Most don't notice the medal at all. And those who do probably assume it's just a decoration, something I bought at a military surplus store. Maybe they think I'm one of those guys who pretends to have served. People see what they expect to see. They see an old man in work clothes pushing a cart, and their brains don't register anything beyond that. I'm furniture, background, invisible. General Thompson leaned back in his chair, his expression deeply troubled. That's the real problem right there. We've created an institution so focused on rank and position and hierarchy that we've forgotten to see the people around us, to ask questions, to look beyond the surface, to honor service regardless of where it comes from or what form it takes. General Hale nodded, his jaw set with determination. Which is why we're going to change that. Starting today, starting now. He looked directly at Frank. Sergeant Major Morrison, I'm formally requesting that you accept a position as Senior Military Advisor for Enlisted Affairs. It's a civilian GS-15 position, significant pay increase, full benefits, and it would involve you working directly with the Joint Chiefs and senior leadership on policies affecting enlisted personnel. You'd have an office, a staff, real authority. You'd be the voice reminding us what it's like on the ground level, what real soldiers need and think and feel. Frank shook his head slowly but firmly. Sir, I appreciate the offer more than I can express, but I'm 77 years old. I'm not qualified for a position like that. I don't have a college degree. Don't know how to navigate Pentagon politics. I'd be out of my depth in about 5 minutes. You're more qualified than anyone in this building because you've lived it. You've led soldiers in combat. You've made life and death decisions under fire. You understand what service and sacrifice actually mean, not just as abstract concepts but as lived reality. That's worth more than any degree or any amount of political skill. But if you won't take a formal position, then let me do this. I want to establish a fellowship program, bringing in retired senior NCOs as advisors and mentors to young officers, teaching them what leadership really means. Not the sanitized version they learn at West Point or ROTC, but the real thing. The hard truths about command and responsibility and the weight of sending people into danger. We'll call it the Morrison Fellowship. Frank looked at the general for a long moment, considering, then nodded slowly. If you do that, sir, make sure it's open to all veterans, not just the ones with medals and citations. Some of the best soldiers I ever knew never got recognized for what they did, because they did their jobs too quietly, too efficiently. They didn't make headlines. They just led their people and brought them home safe, and nobody noticed. Those are the ones who should be teaching the next generation. Agreed. General Hale extended his hand, and Frank shook it. And the general held on longer than a normal handshake, his grip tight with emotion and gratitude. Thank you. For my life 54 years ago. For the example you've set every day since. For still being here, still serving, when you could have walked away decades ago and nobody would have blamed you. You're a better man than most of us will ever be. Just a soldier, sir, Frank said quietly. Same as you. Same as everyone who puts on the uniform and does the job. No, not the same. Better. The kind of soldier the rest of us should aspire to be. The other generals stood, and one by one they came around the table and shook Frank's hand. Real handshakes, firm and respectful, their eyes meeting his with genuine respect and something that looked like shame that they'd never noticed him before, never asked, never looked beyond the surface. Colonel Foster was last, his handshake brief, his face still pale with the realization of how badly he'd misjudged the situation, how close he'd come to humiliating a genuine hero. Frank collected his coffee cart and pushed it toward the door, the wheels squeaking in their familiar rhythm. As he reached for the handle, General Hale called out one more time. Frank, he turned. Sir, my son, the one I named after you. He's a captain now, like I said, deployed in Syria, leading a company of infantry. I tell him your story at least once a year when we talk. He knows that his name carries a weight, a responsibility, that it represents a standard of service and sacrifice that he should aspire to every single day. I just wanted you to know that. Your legacy didn't end on that hillside in Vietnam. It's still growing, still inspiring, still mattering. Frank nodded, his throat suddenly tight with emotion he couldn't quite express. That's good to hear, sir. Really good. Tell him to keep his head down, his powder dry, and his people close. The mission matters, but the people matter more. Always, I will. And Frank, welcome home. You've been home all along, serving in silence, but now we see you, and we're grateful. Frank pushed the cart out into the hallway, the door closing softly behind him with a quiet click. The wheels squeaked as he moved back toward the service elevator, the same route he'd taken thousands of times over 15 years. But his steps were somehow lighter than they'd been, his shoulders straighter, as if a weight he'd been carrying had finally been acknowledged and shared. If you were moved by Frank Morrison's story of quiet service and enduring honor, please like this video, share it with someone who respects our veterans, and subscribe to Silent Veterans for more stories of the unassuming heroes who walk among us.